So, um, good evening, everybody. And just to sort of catch you up, I mean, because I know people have attended or not attended the last couple of classes, and obviously we can't repeat everything each time, but basically we are still on the first Mishnah of this chapter. I'll actually go back to the beginning of the chapter, which says that, all right, on the eve of Passover, adjacent to Mincha time, a person may not eat until dark so that he will be able to eat matzah that night with a hearty appetite. All right, and actually that's the sentence that we're still discussing rather several pages later. All right, even the poorest of Jews should not eat the meal on Passover night until he reclines on his left side, as free and wealthy people recline when they eat, and the distributors of charity should not give a poor person less than 4 cups of wine for the festival meal of Passover night. And this halacha applies even if the poor person is one of the poorest members of society and receives his food from the charity plate. Okay, so, right, and we kind of know that, I mean, one of the questions that I get a lot leading up to Passover is the question of whether, I mean, a lot of people have a custom in their family not to eat matzah the whole 30 days before Passover, not to eat matzah the whole 30 days before Passover. But actually the halacha is that you can't eat it the day of Passover. And the reason for that is that you shouldn't, eating matzah is a mitzvah, right? And so we perform mitzvot enthusiastically, right? And if you've been eating matzah all along, it's hard to say that you're doing it enthusiastically. But here now in the original formulation, which is probably while the temple still stood, it's not only the mitzvah of eating matzah, but it's the mitzvah of eating the paschal lamb, right? So if you've been eating all along, and then the Seder comes and you're not fulfilling the mitzvah enthusiastically, right? So you can't eat even near mincha. And then the question occurs is like, why do we even know this, right? Because you're not supposed to eat after mincha, even on Shabbat or another holiday. So it seems that this Mishnah rather is superfluous, and there's nothing superfluous. But then they're getting into a sort of fine textual distinction between what is the difference between eating near mincha and eating after mincha. I should add, by the way, that I had a professor in rabbinical school who actually had seen the personal Gemara of Shai Agnon. Shai Agnon was the first Israeli to win the Nobel Prize for Literature. And my professor had seen his, and there's a statement in this chapter that says that eating matzah on Erev Pesach is similar to having sex with your fiance in her father's house. Okay, and Agnon had written a little note in his Gemara. He said, "Asiti shnehem ve'enochem," right? I've done both, and there's no comparison. Um, but I digress. Um, so so then we get into the question of what if you, and this is all stream of consciousness, okay, because we're still dealing with the first sentence of the first Mishnah, okay, although we've gotten very far afield, okay. And if you ever wondered where I picked up my teaching style from with digressions all over the place, it's from learning Gemara. Okay, before I learned Gemara, I was always stuck to the subject. But the questions that arise are, what if you are eating a late lunch on Friday afternoon and you look outside and you notice that it's Shabbos? Okay, so what do you do? All right. Or what if you're eating a late lunch on Saturday afternoon and you look outside and you notice that Shabbos is over, right? What do you do? Okay. And there are a couple of issues, right? One is, I mean, primarily, as I read it, the question is, right, what Birkat Hamazon do you say, right? Because the Birkat Hamazon is different for weekdays and for Shabbat, right? So if I ate the meal on a weekday, right, but I'm saying Birkat Hamazon on Shabbat, or conversely, if I ate the meal on Shabbat and I'm saying Birkat Hamazon on the weekday, right, which formula do I use, right? There's also the question of, can I eat before I said Kiddush, right? Or can I eat before I said Havdalah, right? And these are, I mean, again, I'm not saying that these are the kind of questions that any of us, sit pondering and paralyzed by, but they're not negligible questions, right? In the same way that, I don't know. I mean, my pay lags a month behind, right, when I earned it. So like if I earn it in 2022, right, but I don't receive it until 2023, right, which tax year does it fall into, right? I mean, there are answers to these questions, right? I happen not to know them, but there are answers to these questions, right? But it's not and it could, if you're trying to qualify for, an Obamacare subsidy, or trying to qualify for Medicaid or something like that. I mean, this could really matter. It could have very significant consequences. Okay, so let's look at, all right, so we have this dispute between Rav and Shmuel about, between Rabbi Yosei and Rabbi Yehuda. And Rabbi Yosei says, if you're eating lunch late Friday afternoon and you notice that Shabbat has started, keep having your meal. And Rabbi Yehuda says, no, you need to stop. That's all he says. No, you need to stop. But he doesn't say explicitly what you need to do. Okay. And now in a later generation, so here's where we're picking up with verse 10. Rav Yehuda said that Shmuel said the halacha is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, who said that one must interrupt one's meal by removing the table entirely, nor is it in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosei, who ruled that one need not interrupt one's meal at all. Okay, so Rabbi Yehuda, he said, when you interrupt your meal, right? Because now Shabbat has started, you have to remove the table. Okay, now, Leslie, I see you making a face, right? What is it? No, it's fine. I mean, what does it mean, remove the table? Okay, what the heck are they talking about when they say you have to stop and remove the table? And I can only see a handful of people. So if you have an idea, just jump right in.
Well, would that mean completely taking everything off the table?
No, it means removing the table.
Physically, the whole table.
The whole table.
Right.
Well, you say oi, but maybe not.
I've actually done this before, at the Sidarim that I go to in New York, where at that point in the Seder, you remove the entire table from the room. It's an interesting act of theater, and it's supposed to provoke a question.
Right, it is, but I mean, so if you're doing it as an act of theater, okay, or if it's just for Pesach, that's fine, right? But I mean, here is the deal, okay? Right, when we say remove the table, I mean, that seems to be a rather sort of burdensome thing, right? I mean, but imagine, the kind of movies which are set in the Greco-Roman world, right? Where everybody's laying down, right? They're laying down and there's a low table in front of them and they're taking food off the low table and put it in their mouth. Okay, that's what we mean. Okay, otherwise, this whole, I mean, we may get to this in 5 or 10 years, right? But the business of lying on your right side, reclining on your right versus reclining on your left doesn't make any sense either. But there they were talking about literally reclining, okay? In other words, legs stretched out on the floor, and whether you're like this or whether you're like this. Okay, so by removing the table, they mean removing the table, okay? But by removing the table, it's not a whole table that everybody's sitting around. It's more like, let's say, a cafeteria tray with low legs on it, okay? And they literally would remove the table, okay? So that's what Yehuda says, that you have to remove the table, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yossi says, no, you don't do anything. But according to Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda is not the same as Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda is a Tana, and Rabbi Yehuda is an Amora. So a later, not only a later generation, but also lives in Bavel, not in Eretz Yisrael, and carries a much lower level of authority. Okay, but he says one must spread a cloth over one's table and recite Kiddush, after which he may continue his meal. Okay, so you make it's a symbolic separation by spreading the tablecloth. Okay, after which he may continue his meal. All right, and I have to say that this is, as you put it, an act of theater, right? I mean, I'm not going to ask if anybody but me has ever been to mass in a Trappist monastery, okay? But the Trappists have their own ritual that is slightly different than the ritual as performed in a regular church, okay? And at the point in the mass where right before the priests consecrate the bread and wine, okay, which comes out of this, as we'll see, okay, the other monks come and they literally spread a table over the altar, okay, and it's quite a stunning act of religious theater because it emphasizes the idea that the Mass is a meal and the altar is a table and you're setting the table. Okay, and I'm sure that its roots are in this. I'm sure of it, but you know, when you, I mean, without getting too deep, you see in the Catholic Mass roots of Jewish rituals that most Jews no longer actually perform, but the roots of it are in the Mishnah and the Gemara. At any rate, so Rav Yehuda says you spread a cloth, say Kiddush, and then continue your meal. Okay, the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't Rav Tachlifa bar Avidimi say that Shmuel said, just as one interrupts for Kiddush, so one interrupts for Havdalah? So people eating a meal on Shabbat until after nightfall must interrupt their meal to recite Havdalah. The Gemara inquires, what is the meaning of the phrase, one interrupts? Is it not referring to removing the table? The Gemara says, no, it is referring to spreading a cloth, which is sufficient for Havdalah as well. In other words, we have a conflicting opinion that says you must stop, right? So here we have the statement, it's enough, and I know that this is hard to follow. I have trouble following it too sometimes, right? We have the statement from Rav Yehuda, it's enough to spread a cloth and say Kiddush. But then we have a conflicting statement, a seemingly conflicting statement that says, no, you have to stop. But what does it mean to stop? Doesn't stop mean take away the table. But the Gemara resolves the conflict by saying, no, when we say stop, we don't mean take away the table, we just mean spread a cloth, and that's enough for either Kiddush or Havdalah. Okay, so to get back for a second, so in other words, just let me stop sharing for a minute so I can see everybody. Right, essentially, the resolution of the dilemma is identical whether it's Friday afternoon or Saturday afternoon, right? You are having a meal in one time period, right? And then you notice it's become dark and now you're in a different time period. What do you do? Right? What do you do? And there are, I guess, three alternatives. Do nothing, right? Stop and take away the table, which means that's essentially the end of the meal. Or the third alternative is to spread a tablecloth and say either Kiddush or Havdalah, and then continue your meal, right? Which so far the Gemara seems to indicate that the third alternative is what you should do, right? Now, what does that accomplish? What does that accomplish? Spreading the tablecloth and saying either Kiddush or Havdalah. What do you accomplish by that?
It's just symbolically, it's covering the food, so it's like saying you weren't eating and there's no food. It's
okay.
You know,
Right, but what else have you accomplished?
you fulfilled the
separate-
mitzvah.
Yeah, Marcia?
Oh, well, you've accomplished, you've separated, you've started Shabbat, you've separated from the day, from the regular day, and with Havdalah, again, you've ended Shabbat and you moved on to a regular day.
Right, you've made that separation, right?
Mhm.
You've ritually made that separation, right? Which at this point now resolves your dilemma of how to treat it liturgically, right? Because yeah, I ate the bulk of my meal on Friday, but now it's Shabbat. So I celebrate the meal in a Shabbat way, right? Or yeah, I ate the bulk of my meal on Shabbat, but now it's a weekday. So I celebrate the meal liturgically in a weekday manner, right? But in order to do that, right, I need to mark the transition, right? I need to mark the transition, and I do that both, by the physical act of spreading the tablecloth, but also by the ritual liturgical act of saying either Kiddush or Havdalah. Okay, so I mean, again, I'm still, and I said this 2 weeks ago, right? The idea, look, and I am not anywhere near as frum as the Tanaim or the Amoraim, right? But the idea that I could somehow find myself at a loss because I ate lunch on Friday and all of a sudden oh God, it's Shabbos. What do I do now? Right? I mean, to me, that's inconceivable. Right? It's not the opposite way. It's not inconceivable. It's happened to me that I had, in my carefree single days, in my early 30s, and having Shabbos lunch with a lot of people in the same age group roughly, and we're talking and we're singing Shabbos songs, and we look outside and it's time for Havdalah. So that I find not surprising, right? But the idea that these illustrious rabbis could find themselves on a Friday afternoon and all of a sudden it's Shabbos and they hadn't noticed, I do find that a little bit surprising. But we have, I mean, it's not just a theoretical discussion. It's ma'aseh, right? It actually happened. Okay, so but times change and sociology changes. All right, so we'll go on. All right, so now we have another story of something that happens. Okay, the Gemara relates Rabba bar Rav Huna happened to come to the house of the exilarch. Okay, who is the exilarch? Okay, the Aramaic phrase is Reish Galuta. Okay, if you look at the first line that's actually visible on this page, Reish Galuta, or as one of my Aramaic professors said, that this is actually mispointed in all Gemaras. It should not be pronounced Reish Galuta, but rather Reish Galvata, or he pronounced it Reish Galwatha. But at any rate, so in English, this is called the exilarch. Okay, now, question, what the heck is an exilarch? Yeah, Barnaby.
Basically the head of the community in the Babylonian exile.
Right. Okay, but the secular head.
Yes.
The temporal head. All right. He's not the chief rabbi. He's not the head of the academy. He is probably the wealthiest man in the community, and he is he's the head of the community, which means also that he is the one probably for relations between the Jewish community and the Gentile rulers. Okay, but a very an important figure. And so he came to the house of the exilarch. His hosts were reclining for a meal, and the attendants brought a table before him so he could eat as well. Since Shabbat had already started, he spread a cloth over the food and recited Kiddush. Okay, so in other words, the point of this story is again to say that this is not just a theoretical question, all right? This actually happened. And since Rabbah bar Rav Huna actually did it, right, this is sort of a proof text for the fact that this is the proper procedure. Okay, he spread a cloth over the food and recited Kiddush, right? And Leslie, you said spread the cloth over the food, right? I mean, to me, this reminds me, I mean, and maybe this is actually the real origin of the custom that we have of leaving the challah covered when we recite the Kiddush, right? I mean, the sort of child's legend is so that the you know the challah won't be embarrassed, that we say that we bless the wine first and blah 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 blah, and it's great, you know, wonderful for teaching, right? As when I explain this to the kids, right? If we should be concerned for the feelings of a loaf of bread, right, all the more so we should be concerned for the feelings of our fellow human being, right? But maybe this is it, right? That he spread a cloth over the food and recited Kiddush, right? It's probably, I mean, makes sense. All right, this was also taught in a Baraita. The sages agree that one may bring the table only if he has already recited Kiddush. And if one brought out the table before Kiddush, he should spread a cloth over the food and recite Kiddush, right? So now, again, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know with Rabbah bar Rav Huna just happened to be late or what, right? But again, it's individual tables, right? Because they're obviously not bringing out the dinner table just because Rabbah bar Rav Huna showed up, right? One may bring the table, meaning that it's an individual table, right? And if it's an individual table, then it's an individual tablecloth, right? And each person presumably is saying their own Kiddush, right? Or maybe the latecomers are saying their own Kiddush, right? Why would the latecomers be saying their own Kiddush? Because they didn't hear it, right? And you can't eat Shabbat dinner until you've said Kiddush, right? Because you know it's not a Shabbat meal without Kiddush. Okay. So go on. Any questions, by the way? Right. I know that we're kind of speeding through this, but frankly, to me, I mean, this is like less relevant to Pesach, but I don't want to just skip. So, you know, go at 90 miles an hour. It was taught in one Baraita, Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef, who disagree over whether it is permitted to eat from mincha time on Shabbat Eve and whether one must interrupt his meal, agree that one may not begin a meal from this time, right? So, right, you can't, right, they disagree about whether you have to stop the meal on Friday afternoon, but they agree that if you haven't eaten at all, you can't begin a meal, right? So you can't begin a meal late Friday afternoon. And it was taught in the other Baraita that they may agree that one may begin a meal, right? So we have two conflicting traditions, one that says they agree that you can't, and one that says that they agree that you can. The Gemara explains, granted, that which was taught in the first Baraita that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yosef agree that one may not begin a meal, you will find that this is correct with regard to the eve of Passover. As even Rabbi Yosef concedes that one may not start a meal on Passover Eve ab initio. All right, so there's two conflicting Baraitas, but they're not really conflicting. One is talking about Erev Pesach, and one is talking about Erev Shabbat and other holidays, right? And this, I mean, is pretty clear, right? I mean, who could imagine, you know, beginning a meal even without matzah, you know, I don't know, 3, 4 o'clock on Erev Pesach, right? I mean, nobody would do that, right? However, with regard to the other Baraita, which taught that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi agree that one may begin, when does this halacha apply? If we say it is referring to the eve of Shabbat, this cannot be the case, as it was taught that Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi indeed disagree over whether one may start a meal at that time. The Gemara says it is not difficult. Here, the Baraita in which Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yossi agree that it is permitted to start a new meal is referring to before 9 hours of the day have passed, as everyone agrees that it is permitted to commence a meal at this time. Conversely, there, the Baraita in which they disagree over whether it is permitted to start a new meal is referring to later in the day after 9 hours, okay? 9 hours, I can't tell you exactly when that is because it right, there's the concept of what are known as halachic hours, okay? What is a halachic hour is 1/12 of the period between dawn and dusk. Okay, so 9 hours is like 3/4 of when 3/4 of daylight has elapsed. Okay, so the question is, everybody agrees that before 3/4 of daylight have elapsed, you can start a meal, but the question is whether you can start a meal after that. Okay.
In the New Testament, they talk about Jesus being on the cross at 3 p.m. So if the day started at 6 a.m. and ended at 6 a.m., that would be 9 hours.
Right. And I wonder what the original text said, right? Whether it said, you know, I mean, certainly, even it does talk about watches and so on in the Gospels, right? So although that would be, I mean, if it is the 9th hour and Jesus is the Korban Pesach, right? There's a connection. I mean, all this is deeply, deeply connected. Right. So now we're getting to something that's still has very little to do with the Pesach Seder, and it's still just stream of conscious, but it's something that is more familiar to us, okay? The Gemara continues to discuss the halachot of Kiddush, right? Why is the Gemara discussing the halachot of Kiddush, right? Because it's stream of consciousness, okay? And we're talking about Kiddush and when you say it and so on and so forth, right? So with regard to those people who recited Kiddush in the synagogue, as was customarily done at the conclusion of the prayer service on Shabbat night, right? And we know this, right? We say Kiddush in shul. I mean, if we ever had Friday night services in shul again, we would say Kiddush, right? But we still say Kiddush during our Zoom service, right? Rav said they have not fulfilled their obligation to recite a blessing over wine. That is, the blessing over the wine in the synagogue does not enable them to drink wine at home without an additional blessing. However, they have fulfilled their obligation of reciting Kiddush. Okay, so, right, in other words, let me try and break this down a little bit. Okay. Right, we say Kiddush in shul, right? We say Kiddush in shul, and Kiddush is actually two different blessings, right? It's Borei Peri Hagafen, right? The blessing over wine, and it's Mikadesh HaShabbat, the sanctification of Shabbat, right? Now, the Gemara is soon going to discuss the question of why we say Kiddush in shul at all, okay? But here, the question that the Gemara is asking is, right, I've been in shul, right? And obviously it's taken for granted that you're not having your Shabbat dinner until after shul, right? You don't have the Shabbat dinner before shul, right? In a traditional lifestyle, right? So I've been to shul and I've heard Kiddush, right? And now I go home, right? Can I say, I don't have to do this again. I already did it, right? And the Gemara answers, you have not exempted yourself from saying the blessing over wine, but at least for now, it seems that you have exempted yourself from saying the blessing, from saying the Kiddush. Okay, now what's conceptually the difference, right? In other words, and just to be clear, right? I mean, and this is a puzzlement for the Seder, as we'll see. Okay. It's Shabbat dinner, right? And I have guests, or I am a guest, or whatever, right? And forget shul, okay? We begin the meal with Kiddush. We say Borei Pri Hagafen, and then, I drink the wine that's in my cup for Kiddush, right? And then, I don't know, it's half an hour later, I've had that, I say, hey, please pass me the white. I pour myself some more wine. Do I have to say Borei Pri Hagafen again? Yeah, yes or no? No.
No.
Leslie, why not?
I don't know. I don't know, but I wouldn't think every time you have a glass of wine, you have to say that. You said it, and that's separating the regular from the sacred, from the profane. The
Right.
everyday.
No, it covers all the wine you're going to have during the meal, right? It covers all the wine you're going to have during the meal, right? Now, later on, it's gonna qualify that. It's gonna say, yeah, it covered, right? Because nobody anticipates in the same way, right? That if
I have an example.
yeah,
You said that if when you first put on the tallis, you say a prayer, but if you take off your tallis and put it back on again, you don't have to say the prayer again.
exactly, right? Because it covers it. It's covered, right? It's covered. Or similarly, I don't know. So my host is having, instead of having a big challah and slicing it and right. Everybody has their own challah roll, right? And now I've eaten my challah roll, and I say, could I have another one? I don't have to say hamotzi a second time, right? It covers everything that I'm going to have during the meal, right? I mean, the Gemara in this chapter later on is going to say that is true unless you are dining at the house of the exilarch, right? Why is it not true if you're dining at the house of the exilarch? Okay, because the point is, right, why is all the wine that you're going to have covered by saying Pri Hagafen once? Because you have in mind, right, this covers all the wine I'm going to drink, right? And you have as much or as little as you want, and it's covered, right? But why is dining at the house of the exilarch different?
Because it's not your wine.
It's not your wine, but therefore what? I mean, if I have dinner at your house, it's also not my wine. But you're going to let me have as much wine as I want, right? The exilarch, if I am having dinner at my house, who decides how much wine I have?
You do.
I do. If I'm just having dinner at your house, who decides how much wine I have?
You do.
Right. If I'm having dinner at the house of the Exilarch, who decides how much wine I have?
You have to assume he does.
He does. Right. So therefore, I can't have in
Sorry.
mind to
Sorry.
cover all of the wine that I'm going to have because I don't know how much that is. It might be one glass, it might be many glasses. It depends on how generous the Exilarch is feeling or how well disposed the Exilarch is to me on that particular day. Right. So if you're having dinner at the house of the Exilarch, you have to say Borei Pri Hagafen for every glass of wine. Okay, but under other circumstances, no, it covers the entire meal. Right? Yeah, Mike.
So I apologize for being late. I forgot that this class was happening.
Okay.
So, but a couple of questions that are in my head when I read this stuff.
Okay.
I thought that you don't say a bracha twice because that you've already said the bracha and then it would be taking God's name in vain because it was an unnecessary bracha. So
Right.
that's why we don't. But the stuff you sent said if you were switching kinds of wine, then you would say a bracha again.
All right, we haven't gotten there yet.
Oh, okay. But my question to you, I mean, on the one hand, you read this thing and it sounded like hair splitting from antiquity, and I can't believe that, except here we are on Zoom on Friday night. We're not in shul, we're at home.
Right.
The Shaliach Tzibur, after the Amida, you would normally, well, because you're making Kiddush, I would say Vayachulu, because it's in the book.
Right.
And then you would make Kiddush, but I don't know what you do afterward for home Kiddush. But when you were on vacation, I made Kiddush, and so I did not say Vayachulu because I was home.
Right.
And I was going to say Kiddush. And where I come from, Vayachulu is part of Kiddush on Friday night. And to say it twice is wrong. And so I just said Vayachulu when I made Kiddush, but not after the Amida where the book put it. But I never got to talk to you about it, so I have no idea if I was right or wrong.
Well, I mean, I think some of those questions the Gemara is going to address. Okay, the Gemara is going to address that. I mean, obviously, it doesn't say, and
In case of
if
Zoom.
you're on Zoom, right? You know, Maaseh shahayu bezoom, right? But I mean, I would say, and it's not so far ahead, right? That it says that. All right, so let me explicate this sentence that we just read, and then you'll see that it's responsive to your question. Okay, so here the Gemara is saying, right, if you heard Kiddush in shul and now you go home for dinner, you don't have to say Kiddush again, that is to say Mekadesh HaShabbat, right? But you do have to say Borei Pri Hagafen again, right? And the reasoning would be that A, there's a sufficient time lapse, but B, because you have to say the blessing in the place where you're eating the meal.
But also it said when you're home, there are people at home who didn't hear you at shul.
Right, which is why you have to say it a second time.
Right.
For
Agreed.
them. For
Right.
them, because otherwise we would have exactly that fear of saying it twice.
Correct.
And the second time unnecessary. Right? But you have to say it when you get home for them. Right? But
Right.
the point that I'm saying is that there is a principle of Kiddush bimkom seudah. You have to say Kiddush
In the place
in
you
the
eat.
place where you're having your meal. Right? So the question then is, okay, you have to say Kiddush in the place where you're having your meal. What does the word place mean?
Right.
Right? And this is where it becomes tricky, right? But I would say, and I think I would say the same to you, right? Because from the looks of where you are in your basement.
Correct.
I am in my basement. Okay. I do not eat my Shabbos dinner in my basement.
Correct.
I presume that neither do you eat your Shabbos dinner in your basement.
Correct.
Right. So therefore, I would say that even if there's nobody else, right, I would say that you've got an issue because you haven't said Kiddush in the place where you're having your meal.
Right. That's what the Gemara said.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
because there was an example of a guy on one level of his house going to the other level of his house,
Right.
and therefore he had to say Kiddush again.
Right. Now it was more complicated for me when my Zoom studio was in my dining room.
Ah,
Right. But since I moved my Zoom studio to my basement and gave my wife back her dining room, right? I mean, clearly I am not saying Kiddush in the same place where I'm having my Shabbos dinner.
right.
I'm not. So I think that, by analogy, the question that arises about Kiddush in shul, but now I'm home, I think is still a valid question. I think it is. And that's why this is not just, look, I mean, I recognize that there is a certain attitude that says, who cares? Right. But I also presume that if this stuff interests you enough to be in a Gemara class where this is discussed, you're not one of those people who says, who cares? Right. I mean, and again, it may not matter to you. I'm not saying that you must follow this to a T.
No, it
But
matters.
you recognize that it does matter.
It matters, but then you bump into different lines in the sand. So this whole thing in this piece of Gemara is about whether you say Kiddush here or there, or does it count, or do you have to repeat it? But then there's this another rule that I don't know where you point to that says you don't take God's name in vain. And Barnaby draws the line at repeating any word.
Right.
I draw a line at repeating God's name in whatever. But to say a bracha when it's not required, to me, is taking God's name in vain. So it's not a matter of simply, is it necessary or not? It's a question of, is it a sin or not?
Right. No, I
A
get it.
violation or not?
We all draw the lines differently. And I would say that but your underlying assumption that saying Kiddush a second time is not necessary is false. Because it is necessary because you're in a different place.
Right.
That's a
Because
tough
you're in a
one.
different place. Okay. Now,
I
in
have a
terms
question.
of, I see you, Liz. I'll get to you in a second. I mean, in terms of Barnaby's practice when he's Shaliach Tzibor versus your practice when you're Shaliach Tzibor, this is a case, there is a minhag mivatel halacha, all right? Or as it's said in Yiddish, and I don't know Yiddish, but I've had it quoted to me, minhag brech adin, okay? Is that Barnaby, there is no doubt that Barnaby is correct in terms of black letter halacha. None whatsoever. Okay, black letter halacha is we do not repeat words in davening. Conservative North American minhag is that we do, right? And there is the question of whether our contra halachic minhag is so widespread and of such long standing that we would now say that not that black letter law notwithstanding, it is an acceptable practice because it has become widespread. Okay, and my solution is that Barnaby's right and you're right, and that Barnaby should absolutely do what his halachic consciousness tells him he should do, and you should do what your sense of our minhagim tells you to do, and neither one is right or wrong.
But even if that makes good sense. But for example, Friday night and Saturday morning, there's a paragraph Vishamru, and it's a song. We sing it, and one of the ways singing it repeats God's name,
right,
and one doesn't,
right.
So I'm really uncomfortable using that other way.
Sure, I hear
just for that reason, but it's part of the conservative minhag.
Right. I mean, look, you can have minhagim that are so egregiously contra halachic that they need to be stamped out. Right. I mean, as in my opinion, opening the ark with 9 people and doing everything that requires a minyan, which to my mind is so egregiously contra halachic that when I came, I said, we're not doing that anymore.
Oh, and we would count the Torah as the 10th.
For everything, not just for the final morning.
For everything.
Right.
And so that, but you said, well, we could do it only for humanitarian reasons, which means if somebody's saying Kaddish, we could count it so that they get to say Kaddish. That's right. I remember that. Right.
Okay, now, Leslie, you've been waiting so patiently. I hope you still remember your question.
No, I don't think I have a question. Thank you.
Oh,
go
come
ahead,
on,
please.
dig it out.
Please.
Oh, no, I was just going to ask if people who are very observant, are they the ones, I mean, do they know all these rules?
No,
Good
not
question.
necessarily.
I mean, that's one of the horrors of Judaism is this, all these books exist and nobody but the rabbi got to read them.
Well, I mean, that's no longer true because of, the chief rabbi of the American Jewish community, Rabbi Arthur Sproul. But the Art Scroll phenomenon has pluses and minuses, right? I mean, the plus is that it's no longer just the domain of the rabbis, right? The minus is it proves, first of all, the truth of the saying a little learning is a dangerous thing, as well, right? Because anybody feels now that they can challenge the rabbi because they saw it in Art Scroll or they Googled it or whatever. But beyond that is that Art Scroll, I mean, and my objection to Art Scroll is that it presents fringe opinions as normative halakha. And therefore it presents the halacha is much more stringent than it actually is at times. No, but you should not assume that just because somebody is very observant means necessarily that they're knowledgeable. I mean, the two do not always go hand in hand.
They usually don't. Yeah.
Yeah, they often don't. Okay, so let's see where we are and if I can. All right, so let me go back and do the screen share again. We'll go a little bit further. All right. So now the way we've left it is that Rav essentially says you go home, you still have to say Borei Priya Gafen, but you don't have to say Mekadesh HaShabbat because you've already said it. But Shmuel said even the obligation of Kiddush they have not fulfilled, and they must recite Kiddush again at home. The Gemara asks, but why? Why should one have to recite Kiddush a second time at home if he has already fulfilled his obligation in the synagogue? The Gemara answers, he must repeat Kiddush to fulfill the obligations of his children and the members of his household who did not come to the synagogue. The Gemara, so I'll end this. I'll end with this. Okay. The Gemara asks, but according to the opinion of Shmuel, why do I need to recite Kiddush in the synagogue at all if one does not fulfill his obligation with that Kiddush, right? I mean, so fine. I have to say Kiddush again a second time because of the people at home who didn't go to shul. Then why am I saying it in shul, right? I mean, right? I mean, after all, 2,000 years from now, Goldman is going to come along and say, but wait, you're not supposed to repeat stuff unnecessarily, right? If you're not supposed to repeat stuff unnecessarily, why say Kiddush in shul at all? It's a good question. It's a very good question. Why do we say Kiddush in shul? Right?
Because
why do we say Kiddush in shul? The Gemara answers the purpose of Kiddush in the synagogue is to fulfill the obligations of the guests who eat and drink and sleep in the synagogue. Since these visitors are staying in the synagogue for Shabbat, they must hear Kiddush there, right?
Yeah,
why? Because you have to say Kiddush in the place where you're having your meal. And you're having your meal in the shul, so therefore you have to say Kiddush in the shul, right? And historically, that is absolutely the reason why we have Kiddush in shul, right? We have Kiddush in shul because travelers stay in the shul, and we say Kiddush for them, right? Which then raises the question, okay, but nowadays we don't do that, right? We don't do that. I mean, I do not recall ever in the 10 and a half years that I've been here having somebody sleep in the shul on Friday night, right? So if we instituted the saying of Kiddush in the shul for the people who are sleeping in the shul on Friday, I mean intentionally sleeping. I'm not talking about unintentionally sleeping, right? We didn't institute Kiddush for Stan Ginsburg, right? If we instituted it for the people who sleep in the shul and people no longer sleep in the shul, let's get rid of it. Let's get rid of it. So why don't we get rid of it?
Fast forward 3,000 years from the Gemara to a year before the pandemic, and you had people in shul who did not go home and say Kiddush.
Bingo. Exactly, right? That is a sociological answer at any rate. It may not necessarily be a halachic answer.
Well,
but
that's
we know.
but you're so good at that, is taking halacha from the antiquities and applying it to contemporary Judaism.
Right,
That's
right.
a really
No,
good
and
example.
Right, and that is precisely exactly it, is that it is reasonable to assume that at least some of the people who heard Kiddush in shul will not say it when they get home. So at least they will have heard it or said it once. That's exactly it. I mean, that is, classic conservative halachic methodology.
Exactly.
That our sociology has changed and our halacha has to evolve to stay in step with the sociology. Perfect, exactly. All right.
Or maybe to put it another way, it's become the community norm now. Yeah.
It's
the
become the community
norm, right?
Right. But
And to
having said that, if I thought that everybody who was at shul was saying Kiddush at home, or B, that by explaining, look, we're getting rid of Kiddush in the shul because it was originally instituted for people who were sleeping in the shul. So we're not doing that anymore. Go home and say Kiddush at home, that that everybody would actually do it.
Right.
I would get rid of it. Right. But I can't have confidence that that would in fact happen.
Right.
Right. So, therefore, in other words, yeah, you're right that it's become the communal norm. Right. But it's become the communal norm. It's not contra halakha. I mean, it's certainly not contra halakha. The Gemara says you should do it. So, but the Gemara also gives a reason for why you should do it, and the reason no longer applies. Right. But, so I would prefer to say, it's likely that some people are not going to hear Kiddush at all, and if they don't hear it in shul.
But that's no different than celebrating certain holidays on the second day. The reason we did that is no longer needed, but we still do it. So
I agree with you.
Yeah, that's the same thing.
Right. No, look, I agree with you. I mean, I think that, Orthodox authorities go through lots of mental gymnastics to justify why we need to still observe it. Okay. This is more complicated than we have time for right now. But you're absolutely right. And there are in fact downsides as well. I mean, because if the second day of Yontif is not actually Yontif, right, then, and people don't put on tefillin on the second day of Yontif, because you don't put on tefillin on Yontif. But if it's not really Yontif and people aren't putting on tefillin, so that's a problem too. Right? I mean, so there are halachic downsides. It's inertia. I mean, for me, it is primarily, and my own position is that, and I said this, I believe I said this when I first came, is that I would not be the one to advocate that we stop observing the second day, but I would also not oppose it. In other words, right, it's not going to be me who agitates for that change, but if there is a sufficient groundswell, and frankly, I mean, it has to be from people who otherwise come on the second day, right? I mean, if somebody says, I don't come on the first day, I don't come on the second day, but get rid of the second day, I'm not so interested, right? But people who do come on the first, at least on the first day, right? I am interested in what they have to say. So, I mean, but that's my position. I'm not going to be the one who pushes it, but I wouldn't oppose it either. Because I think that there are cogent reasons for not doing it. Anyway, thank you for coming. Good night. Good
Thank you,
Shabbos.
Father,
Yeshikoa.
thank you.
No, wait a minute. This is
Oh,
not
what?
every Thursday, right? Is it just
Every
once
other Thursday.
every other
Every other
Thursday?
Thursday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it.
Okay.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, night.